At 2:20 p.m., 700 feet above the Barents Sea, a Russian Il-76 cargo plane lined up on a black shadow barely under the surface of the water. Below it is a 574-foot Borei-class submarine with her tower barely visible against a horizon of steel-gray water. But this first pass was only a dry run. The crew wasn't dropping yet. They were testing calculations, gauging the crosswinds, and steadying their nerves. One mistake here, and the submarine would vanish beneath the waves before they could try again. The almost impossible mission is to drop a 600-kilogram reinforced titanium container with exact precision onto an ocean target smaller than a football field, while flying a transport jet that handles like a brick with wings. If the plane misses, Moscow loses face on the global stage after over 6 months of planning. And if it manages to hit too close, they risk damaging the $890 million nuclear submarine they're trying to resupply. There is no space for error on this mission. The mission began 5 hours earlier at 9:30 a.m. when the Il-76 lifted off from Severomorsk 1 airbase, with its engines clawing for altitude under a cold October sky. On board the plane, the secret package wrapped in waterproof polymer, padded with foam, and fitted with a crude flotation collar, looked more like camping gear than military hardware. Finding the submarine wasn't the problem. The Borei-class Knyaz Vladimir had been running silent, drifting with currents for hours, her last position logged somewhere inside a 40-square-mile box of ocean emptiness. But radar doesn't see submarines, and satellites can't track a hull that barely breaks the surface of the water. To find the submarine, the Il-76 crew relied on a burst of encrypted data, transmitted in just 1.7 seconds, not nearly enough in the large ocean. By 12 p.m., the transport search radar finally caught a faint contact with the submarine. The steel appeared, vanished, and reappeared at intervals. The aircraft banked in and began descending toward a maneuver Russian pilots are never trained to perform: a precision cargo drop at wave-top altitude. At 12 p.m., the radar operator finally saw something that wasn't the sea. The scope showed a smear, then nothing, then a sliver again, a contact that winked in and out as swells rolled over black steel. Every time the submarine's sail rose, the beam kissed it, but then a wave buried it immediately. This continued for a while. The Il-76, being a cargo hauler and not a fighter jet, wasn't designed for this kind of flying. At 700 feet over the Barents Sea, this is a very big gamble. The flight engineer leaned out, squinting at the waves rushing below, and muttered, "She's flying heavy for this low in altitude." He wasn't wrong. Still, the only way to drop a package in the ocean is to get close enough to smell the salt spray. That's when they got their first reality check. At 12:30 p.m., the headwind wasn't playing by the forecast. Stronger, meaner crosswinds appeared, hitting them at an angle that made the Il-76 sway on the open seabed. Down low, the air thickened. Every correction was taking the crew just a little too long to make. The pilot tightened his harness and to himself, small corrections, no heroics. Meanwhile, below the turbulence, the submarine was fighting its own battle. The Knyaz Vladimir was balancing in the water as ballast tanks hissed, trims clicked, and every other adjustment was being made. Too much power, and the propeller wake would scream to satellites watching overhead, "Here we are!" Too little, and the ocean currents would shove her around like a toy. The sea pushed, and the crew pushed back in a quiet duel. At 12:52 p.m., the submarine came up to the surface a little bit, just 2 minutes at periscope depth, long enough to be sighted by the plane. Then, that's when a RIB appeared. 4 sailors crouched inside, their faces tight, like men quietly cursing the life choices that had carried them here. Their job was as cruel as it was simple. On paper, it seemed like a simple mission, but in reality, what they were to do could easily be summed up as threading a rubber dinghy between a nuclear sub and a Soviet-era cargo jet skimming the waves while the ocean itself tried to kill you. By 1:08 p.m., the Il-76's navigator had gone quiet. The pilot stretched the search grid, folded it back, and let the radar squabble with the data. Slowly, a lane emerged from the fog. The pilot nodded once and said, "We have a path," and that was all it took to commit. In the cargo bay, the loadmaster checked the package again, as if it might have changed in the last 5 minutes. It was still there, wrapped in orange foam that stood out against all the dull gray around it, with no beacon and no tracker. Just a buoyant canister filled with faith. He stroked the release lever nervously in a moment between ritual and desperation. Then, at 1:35 p.m., the Il-76 began its descent into the madness of the water below. Cargo pilots are trained for dirt strips, for crosswinds, for engines dying over mountains, but not these types of maneuvers. Threading steel at 210 knots, just 700 feet above a sea that looked like it wanted to climb inside the cockpit, wasn't in his manuals at all. The jet groaned, shook like a crate of bolts. The co-pilot kept his voice even, like he was reading at a funeral. 210 knots, 700 feet, heading 085. Copy, the pilot said softly, nudging the yoke no more than a millimeter. In the Barents, a millimeter was enough to kill. By 1:40 p.m., the ocean turned full savage. The waves began stacking into jagged walls. Whitecaps burst, died, and reappeared like ghosts. The horizon wavered, tricking the eye into chasing shadows. But in all of these, the pilot kept his rhythm as he took short glances in and out of the plane. Glance inside, glance outside. Then the radar operator broke the silence. Contact steady. Drift 3 knots east by northeast. RIB beam. Sub-trimmed high, he said with a flat voice, as if he was scared he would jinx his instructions. The translation of what he just said simply meant, the submarine is steady, but too much of its back is showing. It's too exposed. The pilot bit the inside of his cheek, and we'll take it, he responded. At 1:49 p.m., the co-pilot called, final check. The loadmaster pressed his face to the tiny porthole, and all he saw was water rising and falling like a restless beast, with no sub in sight, no RIB. But somehow, that felt right to him, because faith on missions like this was blind. He ran the math in his head again. Drop height, fall time, forward throw, drift. 2 minutes, the pilot said in a calm, cold, and still voice, while the cockpit drove mad with vibrations. And by 1:51 p.m., the Nyaz Vladimir rolled on a broadside wave, flashing wet black steel through the spray like a shark's skin. The plane's radar spiked, the RIB bobbed nearby, with sailors clinging like men nailed to fate. Their encrypted radio crackled. Re-be ready, sub-steady course. As they held on for dear life, the ground effect slammed the Il-76 up, then yanked it down like a toy elevator at 1:53 p.m. The pilot corrected it with a surgeon's touch. Speed? 210. Holding, came the reply. They ran a dry pass at 1:55 p.m. Cargo still bolted down. The aircraft thundered over the zone, every man in the bay straining for cues. Waves, drift, that phantom line where math meets sea. The pilot finally ordered, turn out. Another pass wasted. Another minute lost. The crew's silence grew heavier than the storm. 2:02 p.m. came along, and a new data burst shifted the equation. The drift had changed, although just slightly, but slightly was fatal in this business. 2 degrees right, the navigator called. 2 right, the pilot, rolling the big jet with all the grace its bulk allowed. At 2:07 p.m., the loadmaster slid the locking pin free. The lever was brutishly simple, like a farm tool in a flying machine. The loadmaster wrapped his fist around it like gripping destiny. The deck vibrated, engines howled, airframe rattled with the strain of being asked to do something no designer had imagined. One last recalculation of height, speed, drift, and sub's course was done by instinct as he picked his spot, an invisible scar across the waves, and swore to hit it. By 2:14 p.m., the horizon had steadied as the Barents hissed like a live wire below. The submarine carved its line, dull and dark, with the RIB dancing close by on the waves. This is the one, the pilot said with a flat voice, and just 2 minutes later the co-pilot's voice tapped the beat like a metronome. Airspeed 210, altitude 700, heading 087. The engineer scanned his dials. Temperatures were reaching a fever pitch. Vibrations were flirting with limits, and the aircraft itself was holding its breath, just like the crew on board it. Just at exactly 2:18 p.m., the nose dipped, the ocean flooded the windshield, and the loadmaster finally had eyes on it. Black steel slicing the gray water, the RIB thrashing nearby. He counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, hold. The pilot. Not to the crew on board, but to the sea below. The package waited. The ocean seemed to draw in a breath. The Il-76's cabin had become an oven of sweat and nerves. Oxygen masks dangled unused, but the recycled air was hot and stale, carrying the metallic sting of hydraulic fluid and the faint ozone burn of overworked electronics. The payload officers checked straps again, knuckles white on clipboards, as if sheer grip strength could hold back catastrophe. The load itself was still waiting, strapped in its flotation collar canister. Every vibration of the plane seemed magnified through it. The men working the load good luck to themselves. They knew at this point of the mission they greatly needed that. They were Russian airborne, but no one had ever rehearsed this exact maneuver before. That's when the navigator called out over the intercom. Approach vector locked. Wind at 12 knots, cross. Visibility low, waves moderate. Bearing correctly. From the cockpit, the Barents Sea was a canvas of shifting steel, the horizon broken only by the black dorsal line of the submarine below. The Borei-class boat, 574 feet of silent power, was holding position with minimal ballast shift. Her captain stood at the conning tower hatch, oilskin collar up against the spray, peering into the skies through his large binoculars. By 2:31 p.m., it was about 5 minutes to the drop. On the submarine, klaxons echoed, and inside the belly of the boat, sailors scrambled in cramped passageways, tightening bulkhead seals, stowing unsecured gear. In the missile compartment, giant R-30 Bulava launch tubes slept under armored hatches, their guardians as nervous as the air around. Captain Sokolov had remained iron-faced even in the storm spray. He keyed his handset and gave out instructions in a steel-cold tone. All hands brace. Shock sequence incoming. This is not a drill. A junior officer glanced up at him from the bridge hatch and replied with a brittle voice, "Comrade Captain, if the drop is off by even 20 meters." Sokolov cut him off with a cold stare. "Then we trust that Moscow knows the value of precision." His words carried no conviction, only duty. The clock had hit 2:33 p.m. 3 minutes to the drop, and back in the Il-76, Commander Malenkov could feel the eyes of his crew flicking toward him between every call-out, watching constantly to gauge his nerves. So he forced his shoulders straight in an attempt to appear completely unnerved. He pressed the transmit button, voice steady but low. Submarine visual. Drop sequence armed. Lock bay doors. Hydraulics whined, and the steel belly of the giant transport yawned open. Cold wind knifed through the cabin, whipping papers into the air and frosting the sweat on the crewmen's brows. Below them, the shadow of the submarine waited, a lone monolith in endless gray water. The payload shifted forward half an inch with the tilt of the nose. For a moment, everyone thought it might go early. A loadmaster slammed a boot against the brake clamp, pinning it in place. His heart galloped. 2 minutes to the drop, at 2:34 p.m., the mission commander to no one in particular, 600 kilograms, falling less than 1,000 meters. If this misses. His words met silence from the rest of the crew. Outside, the sea wind clawed at the fuselage, shaking rivets loose in their seats. The altimeter ticked, 690 feet, 670, 650. The Il-76 was running lower than doctrine allowed, lower than anyone sane would fly in heavy seas. But it was a time that called for desperate measures. On the submarine, Captain Sokolov could hear the roar of the approaching engines above the wind. His men crouched deeper into their compartments as they muttered silent prayers in orthodox cadences. The captain alone remained upright, scanning the silver belly of the Il-76 as it cut low through the mist. And barely 1 minute to the drop, he went through the final checklist in rapid-fire speed. Altitude 640, stable. Wind cross 15, payload track aligned. Safety pins disengaged. Captain Malenkov's hands tightened on the yoke. He glanced once at the mission clock, then forced the final instructions out with a stone-cold voice. Execute. At 2:36 p.m., the drop was imminent. The clamps were released with a hydraulic shriek, and for half a heartbeat, the payload refused to move, as if clinging to the steel tracks of the plane. Then gravity seized it. The canister thundered backward. It sounded like a rolling earthquake that rattled the bay. Loadmasters threw themselves against the walls as the package slid out into the open sky. It fell nose first, slicing into the wind, stabilizer fins, and a single parachute canopy unfolding from its flanks. The parachute slowed the descent, but not enough to soften the blow. When the canister struck the Barents Sea, a violent plume of spray shot high, yet the flotation collar kept it bobbing upright. Almost instantly, the RIB throttled forward. Sailors leaned out with poles, snagging lines, dragging the container closer. Waves slammed it against the boat, nearly flipping them, but the men held fast, Within minutes, it was hooked and lashed. Winches whined, pulling it toward the submarine's waiting deck. The Il-76 went completely silent at 2:37 p.m. as the men stared down at the boiling sea, ears ringing, stomachs hollow. The canister floated, buoyancy collar holding steady. Then the submarine's crew scrambled out onto deck lines, securing it with magnetic clamps. The mission was successful. The Il-76 banked hard, nose pointing south toward home. The mission was done, yet the weight on their shoulders hadn't lifted. If anything, it grew heavier. For what they had just delivered into the black belly of the sea was no ordinary cargo. It was a weapon born of desperation, a new experiment whose existence even the Politburo of only behind closed doors, and the ocean had just swallowed it whole. At 2:47 p.m., the package was still afloat, drifting in the steel-gray water as its parachute collapsed and spread across the waves like a jellyfish. Below, the Borei-class submarine waited, hovering at periscope depth, a silent behemoth watching its cargo dance in the swell. On board the Il-76, the tension was still present. Captain Leonid Sokolov's hands shook on the yoke as he leveled out the jet. He'd just committed one of the riskiest deliveries in modern military aviation, dropping critical cargo not onto land, but into the open ocean, above one of the most secretive assets in Russia's arsenal. "Parachute is stable. Drift within 200 meters," reported the loadmaster. His voice was hoarse, adrenaline chewing at his throat. "Package afloat." The navigator gave a silent nod by 2:49 p.m., reporting, "Recovery window optimal. The submarine is surfacing." Immediately he said this. A boiling mass of white water tore open the Barents Sea. The Borei-class submarine rose like a leviathan from the abyss, all 574-foot hull in full glory, the conning tower breaching last, the Russian naval ensign snapping in the polar wind. "Christ," one of the Il-76 crewmen over the intercom, like something out of a nightmare. The submarine's deck was manned instantly. Sailors in foul weather gear scrambled across the slick surface, ropes and winches at the ready. The package bobbed nearby, the flotation collar keeping it steady even as waves tried to wrench it away. The parachute drifted off, snagging in the surf. The operation shifted into its second phase, the recovery. By 2:51 p.m., Commander Viktor Malenkov barked orders from the conning tower. "Package, port side, secure it before it drifts." The sailors wrestled lines into the water. Grappling hooks snagged the container's lifting lugs. Winches began hauling, gears screaming in protest as seawater surged over the deck. Slowly, painfully, the package rose out of the waves and clanged onto the hull. Inside were precision components, such as encrypted sonar modules and communication systems flown in under emergency orders. Without them, the submarine's mission would fail. "Package secured," a deckhand pumping a fist into the air. The mission was finally complete.